Hello and welcome back to the Center of Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is a lecture on, it's kind of an intro lecture on Carl Schmitt in our critical theory, introduction to critical theory class. We are reading Schmitt. I realize that Schmitt is not normally considered among the critical theorists, especially of the Frankfurt School. What I'm really using him for in terms of the course is framing what's at stake for the emergence of the Frankfurt School in Weimar, Germany in 1922. And so reading somebody who's politically very different from them, but who has a similar sort of ambivalence about the Weimar democracy or the liberal democracy, the Weimar constitutional democracy that's in place at this point in Germany, very newly in place after World War One, right? Then it gives us a little bit better sense of why why the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School are approaching things in the way that they are doing it. And when they're reacting to older previous thinkers like Karl Marx especially, or Hegel, that's one way to situate what they're doing, but of course they're not exactly doing straight up Marxism either. And so we see some a little bit more of a dimensionality, I think, when we look at Schmitt. And we will look after Schmitt, we're going to look at Vladimir Lenin too, right? So we're going to look at somebody a little bit further right, not just a little bit further right for Schmitt, quite a bit further right. And then somebody further left, we're going to look at Lenin after that. And then we're kind of situating the critical theorists in the center of that. So I'm going to share my screen as usual. I have written out my notes, kind of lecture style. It helps me say less ums, which people critique me for in my YouTube chats. Of course, I'm thinking and all the time and say a lot. So I'm going to share my screen. Notes on Carl Schmitt. Share. Oops, that's different. There we are. Okay. So I'll read this out as normal, and I'll sometimes go off script to clarify some things and take a sip of coffee as I get going. Um, I'll probably do a couple of these videos on Schmitt and dig a little bit deeper into the book, but I think there's a lot of framing that needs to do around not just Schmitt, but this concept of political theology. So he writes a book called Political Theology in 1922. He writes it after an earlier, much longer book called The Dictator. And but the concept of political theology is broader than that. It can sometimes go back to St. Augustine, as I'll cover in a minute here. And there's an kind of a niche area of philosophy these days. There's even a journal called Political Theology that I used to do some work for. We used to be called Political Theology Today, and now it's called the Political Theology Network. So those folks are out there as well. So Schmitt does not own the term political theology, but he's going to be the center of discussion today in his particular book. So let me jump in here. Political theology, as I use the term, relates both to Carl Schmitt's book of the same title, as well as to an interdisciplinary scholarly discussion developing out of the American journal Telos in the late 1980s. Telos is still around. They still deal with Schmitt and issues related to him on a regular basis, among other issues. It also represents a particular tradition within Christian thought, and this is Christian with a capital C here. Christian thinking that engages with ideas as ancient as St. Augustine's city of God. separation between the worldly and the heavenly city, and what should our endeavors in life and in civics, how should they be oriented, is one of the questions Augustine's asking there. My focus here is not Christian, except in the ways that Christianity acts as an underwritten ideology for some of Western liberal thought. I also regularly use, and if you've listened to me lecture in other instances, you've heard this term over and over again. I've just finished writing a book with my colleague Tink Tinker, who's a Wasatch or Osage Nation um, uh, uh, thinker, about this concept. So it's important to me as a thinker. I regularly use the term all lowercase, one word, Euro-Christian, to refer to a larger socio-political process emerging from Europe before secularist ideas of a separation of church and state emerge. Because secularization narratives persist in ways that religion is presented as archaic superstition, and their bracketing function in the self-congratulatory narrative, they accomplish an erasure of responsibility for the destructive and consuming forces at work in both spiritual and material conquests, while maintaining latent investment in them. I know that's a really loaded sentence there. I'll unpack it here as I turn towards one of my former professors' words. Many of my students come to university, where I do most of my teaching, at least the teaching I get paid for, with the idea, a kind of a common liberal secularist idea that religion is something out of the past, that there should be a separation, there at least should be a separation between church and state, whether or not there is one. And yet we do have forces. The Christian right is a real political force in the United States. The Christian Social Democrats are a real political force in Germany, although their versions of Christianity might not always coincide with one another. Current ideas about whether Europe, if it's holding together, is fundamentally a Christian place or remains a Christian cultural place, and whether or not that needs to be defended. So this is an ongoing huge discussion across many different philosophers, not just even this niche area called political theology. It has to do with the narratives that we tell ourselves about where our society emerged from. So when I say the self-congratulatory narrative of liberalism, it's one that says that something like since the French Revolution, we've been on a trajectory that has left religion and the divine rights of kings in the past. So a lot of Americans, when 9/11 happened, for example, immediately characterized Muslims as being kind of irrational religious fanatics. And that is a much older idea in philosophy that shows up in Enlightenment thought. And it shows how we've been influenced by Enlightenment thought. I'll read from Dr. Kahn's book here. So Victoria Kahn has studied the ways 20th century thinkers looked to the early modern period to solve political crises and discussions of liberalism. In her book, Future of Illusion, she gives an account of the familiar liberal narrative. This is what I feel like many people, my students in the United States, have this kind of attitude, even if they haven't really thought that much about it yet. So going all the way back to thinkers like Descartes, the idea of questioning the dogmas that we might have been raised with. This is important, and I really respect Dr. Kahn and her ability to formulate this so succinctly. She says, According to the usual story, we can trace the origins of modernity to the 16th and early 17th centuries in Europe and its resolution of a theological political crisis. The religious wars of this period prompted Hobbes, Spinoza, and Locke to develop a religiously neutral discourse of rights that helped to found the modern liberal state on a distinctively secular foundation. If political theology refers to the theological legitimation of the state or a state founded on revelation, then political theology is the problem that the new secular language of rights was intended to solve. It did so by bracketing the question of religion in the state of nature and subordinating religion to the secular power of the sovereign once the commonwealth has been founded. Instead instead of being guided by the religious principles, individuals, according to the new secular idiom of political theory, are motivated by a desire for self-preservation. That's liberalism, right? The contract that founds the state is simply a contract of protection for obedience, and suspending the question of a substantive common good or end of human action, the new state also removes the occasion for disagreement. Everyone is entitled to practice his religion in private as long as his actions do not impinge on the liberties of others, or, as modern parlance has it, we agree to disagree. This, we might say, is the self-congratulatory narrative of modern liberalism, right? Like, yay, been this, we've accomplished something historically. Liberalism pushed us towards a more individual freedoms, rights, all of that sort of stuff. Victoria Khan's description persists in liberal thought today, yet in the late 20th century and early 21st century, as liberal economies have witnessed increasing crises, this narrative has also been challenged, particularly within the context of neoliberal trade, which I'm not going to say a lot about neoliberalism in this particular lecture, but it's just out there. What I want to emphasize is that in the 21st century, we are amid these crises of liberalism and liberal democracy. We are hearing voices on the further left and on the further right in our own period. And so, part of my rationale here for looking back to the Weimar period is about reflecting on things now, right? So that's part of my methodology here. Political theology as an academic discussion arose in the late 1980s out of a traditionally leftist journal that was first published in the late 60s. Traditionally aligned with a radical leftist critique of culture, the Telos journal later came to be suspicious of attempts to take a position from outside of culture. And this is like in the late 70s, early 80s, as people got more and more rigorous in their scholars got more rigorous in their study of Marxism as the economy changed towards neoliberalism with Thatcher and Reagan. And as the hippies became yuppies in the 1980s, there's another way of thinking about this too. A lot of people's commitment to revolution in the 60s and 70s seemed to be not very much of a staying commitment. So in the late 80s, the journal began to publish a number of articles studying the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt. As Scott G. McNall writes, because of Schmitt's Nazism, quote, the very fact that the journal reviewed and discussed his work was deeply suspect, and Schmitt predicted the decline of federations and nation states, seeing them as inherently unstable, while Telos celebrated loose affiliations, end quote. Telos founder Paul Piccone had been a leftist critic who rejected managerial liberalism and sought to turn, quote, to authors outside of the left and on the edge of liberalism and as sources. And Carl Schmitt was one of the most prominent of these. And the use of Schmitt was to both perfectibility liberals and statist leftists scandalous because he was, in the context of their versions of the century, unambiguously a foe. And so the Telos Journal, when Boccone founded it, it was a journal dedicated to sort of importing the ideas of Frankfurt School types of theorists, of people like Jürgen Habermas, to a United States reading public, an English reading public as well. So that's how it starts in 68, and then it morphs over time, like the next 20 years. So the drama surrounding Telos precedes a larger academic discussion, or a larger academic phenomena in the 21st century, where the critical impulses of the civil rights movements became status quo positions by which political power struggles were waged within existing institutions. So we go from on the street activism, marches on Washington, to a civil rights act, and then to the proceduralism of law and the importation of inclusivity politics into the ways that we run, especially like academic institutions. So we might think of things like inclusive excellence today, as being part of the framework of the institutions themselves. Among the taboos the Telos Journal transgressed were both the serious engagement with Schmitt, who was an outspoken anti-Semite and Nazi, and an increasing engagement with religion that challenged the self-congratulatory liberal secularization narrative that I just described above. So part of this was because Schmitt wrote the book on political theology, which remained influential on the extreme left as well as the right. So Schmitt's 1922 book, Political Theology, famously opens with the statement that the sovereign is the one who makes the decision in the state of exception. We want to hold on to that throughout this introductory course on critical theory, because we're going to read later critical theorists that are dealing with that concept, right? The state of exception. Schmitt describes the sovereign as the one who makes the decision in a state of exception. It also contains the oft-quoted passage from a later essay in the book. Quote, all significant concepts of the theory of modern theory of the state are secularized religious concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. Only by being aware of this analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophical ideas of the state developed in the last centuries. I'm going to pause for a minute here and just talk about that idea of the miracle. There have been lots of other attention in the discourse of political theology on the idea of miracles. But Schmitt is associating the miracle with the state of exception, right? So it might be counterintuitive to think of something like Hurricane Katrina or the COVID pandemic as a miracle, but what he's saying is that what happens when a state of exception arises and there's like we don't know what else to do. In earlier times, that was seen as God's intervention into the temporality of secular time, of the unfolding time of human events, right? Baruch Spinoza, in his political theological treatise, spends a good deal of time saying that may have been miraculous interventions by a God in the past at some point in time, but the Old Testament, or reading of the Old Testament, will show that it doesn't continue that way, that there's a receding of God. So there's that kind of idea. And within modernity, we are completely in historical time as well. And in mythological studies, this idea of secular or historical time versus mythical time, or a sacred time is something that is a conversation that's throughout religious studies and much bigger than this stuff here. Um, but Spinoza, being sometimes considered like a classic liberal thinker, proto-liberal thinker, perhaps, is pushing us in that direction to say that like we might have this notion of secularization, as opposed to um, a sovereign king who's the divine right, by the divine right of kings, in a lineage that is God's sort of representative on earth. Schmitt was the theorist of the exception in jurisprudence, and he linked that to a notion of the theological and the mythological. There is an intersection here between structuralism and history in this passage that manifests in what might be characterized, for me anyway, as the problem of the 20th century, or of 20th century politics, which is a tension between vertical sacred time, being in essence, and horizontal secular time, experience, a tension powerfully, even if oversimplistically expressed by a fellow conservative thinker of Schmidt's, um, Mirsha Eliade, in his famous book, The Sacred and the Profane, which is published in English in the late 50s. So I think that if we're going to return back to Germany of the early 20th century, it's worth considering the place of religion in European discourse of the early 20th century. Um, Modern Europeans gave an increasingly historical account of religiosity, portraying religion as having evolved into a rationalized Christianity that had left religious superstitions in the past. Ludwig Feuerbach, who from the previous lecture, right, following Hegel's historical theory, presented an unenchanted account of Christianity as the product of ideology where humans created God as a kind of superego that allowed them to establish laws and civilizations. So the invention of God by humans is part of the historical development of the species being of humanity and Feuerbach's thinking here. Marx then pushed even further against religion while establishing a line of thinking that would produce religious-like cults of personality, where the communist nations mummified their significant leaders. So even though Marx is this big critic of religion, there are ways that many people have sort of critics have characterized 20th century communism as quasi-religious. Maybe it's a secular type of religion, and then there is this weird phenomenon of mummifying heads of state in communist countries, which is just strange to me. Um, the Euro, the Euro-Christian historical account of religion argued that so-called, quote, primitive people remained in a state of arrested development or pre-political state of nature without the benefits of civilization and enlightenment. I'm thinking particularly of indigenous peoples, right? And you know, so my students know that I have a close affiliation with my colleague Tink Tinker, who is indigenous, and so this is an ongoing part of my own thinking, is a critique of Euro Christianity in this regard. Nietzsche had been drawing on this tradition when he characterized the nihilism of modernity as the death of God. I'm not going to say a lot about Nietzsche here, but what Nietzsche is trying to say in that, and what later thinkers like Hannah Arendt will sort of look back and characterize that as a shift in time, is the emergence of a kind of nihilism in Germany, not just Germany, but throughout Europe, and it's like a kind of identity crisis that without something like Christianity tying down the states, what values hold society together once religion is become this kind of archaeological or anthropological site of just human development instead of something that people actually believe in. John Stuart Mill had argued that a Christian educational development would, quote, civilize the savages and allow them to enter society. So if you read John Stuart Mill's work on utilitarianism, there's a cultivation process that one has to go through. You don't get to just enjoy the rights of freedom of speech until you've become a full citizen. Indigenous people in the United States were not considered that. They were considered out of that. And so the liberal policies which are genocidal, by the way, in the late 19th century, were to um, send Christian missionaries to reservations to Christianize the savages. And then by Christianizing them, they would then blend in and merge with the broader dominant society. And then we get this idea of killing the Indian or to save the man, right? So thus, missionary efforts to kill the Indian and save the man were considered progressive liberal policy in the late 19th century. Well, we're, of course, looking back on this. There's even a current grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities, or not, it's not the National Endowment for the Humanities. There's a government grant right now um, uh, for looking at the military. It's from the U.S. military itself to look at the U.S. military's historical role in genocidal processes right now. So there's at least some sort of internal sort of like reflection going on, whether or not you believe that it's sincere, or who gets the money for to write um, historical accounts of that stuff, maybe is something to be questioned. Uh, while Indians had to be made Christians, modern Euro-Christians were supposedly evolving away from religion altogether. The quote, death of God signaled a crisis in values among Euro-Christians. The famous sociologist Max Weber characterized modernity as being thoroughly disenchanted, yet the aesthetic impulse to account for the irrational was all the rage in the 1920s Germany. So one way to think of this is a way that my friend and colleague Tink Tinker talks about atheism, because a lot of people want to think about religion in terms of belief. That's actually a really Protestant Christian way of thinking about what religion is. And somebody might say, I'm an atheist, right? And Tink will say, you're a Euro-Christian atheist, right? Um, because you cannot have the conception, the identity conception of atheist without it being a rejection of an earlier idea of God. You had to have the idea of God there, and whether even questioning whether or not God exists in order to come to the identity category of being an atheist. And that is part of the Euro-Christian drama that unfolds throughout Europe. For traditional indigenous peoples who maybe didn't have a conception of God to begin with, that's not a process of self-formation that they need to go through. But it's a process of self-formation for people who have lived in the cultural trajectories that emerge from Europe. It's a way of distinguishing for Dr. Tinker and myself, a distinction between indigenous worldview and Euro-Christian worldview, which they can be quite different. That's a different project. So, Max Weber, his name comes up quite a bit with characterizing modernity as disenchanted. He's not the only person. So this kind of thinking about modernity and disenchantment, what's the place of religion, is not just something that Schmitt's doing. It's not something that just critical theorists are doing. It's a bigger question going on during the period. Closely related to that is going to be Freudian psychoanalysis. So the unconscious, the uncanny, the unheimlich, the unhomely, harbored psychological darkness, but also the trappings of older times and cultures. So many times in Euro-Christian thought, primitive, in quotes here, right? So-called primitive people lived not only in a past pre-political time, but there's something about that past pre-political time that haunts our unconscious because it's framed in stages of development especially for a thinker like Freud. In 1917, the German Lutheran theologian Rudolf Otto coined the term numinous to describe what he calls the mysterium tremendum. For him and many others, modernity had alienated humans from the raw and awesome power of ancient religion. And what the result was a kind of contemporary nihilism and materialism, as well as the need on the civilizational level to produce massive wars. So they're trying to understand why things like what World War One just happened, right? Drawing on Emil Durkheim's socialist ideas about religion from the late 19th century, early 20th century, as well as traditionalist thinkers, Mircea Eliade argued that, quote, modern man is out of touch with sacred space, living in the world of the profane and forgetting the centering potential of primitive religious thought. This is what a big part of what conservative thought does, especially with thinkers like Eliade and Schmitt, or a broader movement called traditionalism as well. We could discuss that, and it has ties to emergences of so-called radical Islam in the 20th century as well. Eliade claimed, quote, the sacred reveals absolute reality and at the same time makes orientation possible. Hence, it founds the world in the sense that it fixes the limits and establishes the order of the world. While by today's standards, such binaries oversimplify the matter, so lots of later religious studies scholars critiqued Eliade for this, surely. Eliade's claim also expresses this European nostalgia for a the pre-political, and Eliade's assertion also points to the political space of the sacred in the public sphere. It complicates that congratulatory description of liberalism as well, right? You can kind of feel this tension even in current US politics where the so-called Christian right has associated their Christian values with their conservative politics, right? That's a bigger phenomenon than just the US. Um, If the spiritual is invoked in politics, it is within a deliberative rhetoric aimed at future orientation. Um, Secularization poses a problem both in the traditionalist critiques made by Eliade as well as Schmitt, because both of them refuse to bracket religion. They're not liberals, right? Like what liberalism brackets religion, that's part of its self-congratulatory narrative. But because they refuse to bracket it, they see not only that there might still be a place for it in the public sphere, but they also have a nostalgic longing for it to be present in the current public sphere because they think that it's going to bring a sense of values that coalesces people together. In what Schmidt will call in another book, the friend-enemy distinction. What creates a body of people, right? What creates a culture? Schmidt's conservatism and his description that the sovereign is the one who decides in the state of exception desires a stronger sovereign power embodied in an individual decider that can tell us firmly that yes or no in states of exception, right? Though the tone of political theology from these passages is certainly conservatively critical of liberalism, Schmitt influenced the famous leftist aesthete and dabbler in mind-altering substances, Walter Benjamin, who we will read later on in this course. Benjamin died attempting to flee the Nazis in 1940 and is posthumously associated with what's been called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. They did fund him, but he's kind of an outs. They sometimes helped him. He was very poor in the 1930s, and allowed him to have a meager subsistence for a living because he was not allowed to teach because of his Judaism. Uh, um, so Benjamin is associated with the Frankfurt School, and it's actually Hannah Arendt in the late 60s who does so much to bring these thinkers to a wider reading public. So if you read the old books, sometimes on YouTube I think you can find one of Arendt's what she's working out the preface to one of the editions of uh, Walter Benjamin's uh, essay collections, I think Reflections or Illuminations. Those were the two early collections. Um, and so because she's associated with critical theory too, then that's how kind of Benjamin comes in here a little bit. Um, in his habilitation, The Origin of German Tragic Drama, first published in 1928, Benjamin wrote that, quote, whereas the modern concept of sovereignty amounts to a supreme executive power on the part of the prince, the Baroque concept emerges from a discussion of the state of emergency and makes it the most important function of the prince to avoid this. He then claims, quote, the theological juridical mode of thought, which is so characteristic of the 17th century, is an expression of the retarding effect of the overstrained transcendental impulse, which underlies all of the provocatively worldly accounts of the Baroque, end quote. For Benjamin, then, the focus on the prince as the sovereign was the continued sight of community holding the physical world and the theological world together. The prince is a kind of axis mundi in Eliade's terms. The more worldly the state, the more transcendental the leaders must be, even to the point of non-existing or the empty throne of the sovereign, we sometimes discuss. Benjamin's own notes to this section, though, specifically cite Carl Schmitt's political theology and his description of the exception as inspiration. Yes, the leftists read the rightists um, during this period, and they go on to continue to read Carl Schmitt, right? Especially imagine being a Jewish thinker in Europe after World War II and still engaging with Carl Schmitt, as some did. Carl Schmitt still engages with Walter Benjamin in his book, 1950s book, Hamlet or Hecuba. He returns to this discourse. So, like, why is Benjamin, who'd been dead for almost 20 years, still important to Schmitt at that point in time, right? Um, Obviously, cancel culture is not really happening for these folks where they just like turn off and don't speak to each other because of their extremely different political views. Um, uh, so Benjamin's notes, he specifically cites Carl Schmitt as inspiration here. Samuel Weber writes, Benjamin personally wrote Schmitt sending a copy of The Origin of German Tragic Drama to him and thanking Schmitt for thinking crucial to his aesthetic theory. This is what Benjamin says in a letter to Schmitt. You will very quickly recognize how much my book is indebted to you for its presentation of the doctrine of sovereignty in the 17th century. Perhaps I may also say, in addition, that I have also derived from your later works, especially The Dictator, a confirmation of my modes of research in the philosophy of art from yours in the philosophy of state. Benjamin is largely regarded as one of the most important aesthetes in the 20th century, and David Boothroyd, who's a writer about drugs, has written explicitly of Benjamin's interest in mind-altering substances and the culture on drugs. I have a side pet interest in that, and my dissertations were on psychedelic aesthetics. So I continue to be interested in the ways that people on the far right and the far left were both interested in the technology of psychedelics and mind-altering substances. And I know in broader culture, U.S. culture, oftentimes drugs get associated with the left, but there's always been a conservative right-wing interest as well. Um, through Schmitt, then Benjamin was able to use political theological ideas for the basis of aesthetic criticism, which is not to reduce Benjamin's thought to Schmitt's influence at all. It's just to say that they're in dialogue with each other, right? The political subtext of both Benjamin's and Schmitt's books is the liberal crisis of the Weimar Republic during the 1920s. After World War I, the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated power to the Democratic Republic, but the 1920s were unstable economic times, and the government was politically contested on both the left and the right. To some, it may seem fascinating that the Jewish Benjamin would so openly align his thinking with Schmitt, who was already a conservative and who would go on to become a member of the Nazi Party. So, of course, yeah, the Nazis aren't a big party or anything like in 1922 when political theology is written, right? Um, uh, uh, um, uh, so he also, beyond being just a conservative thinker, we know from other writings of Smith that he's an open anti-Semite as well, right? He's an open anti-Semite, and he also still talks to Jewish intellectuals or engages with their work. The renewed interest in Schmidt in journals like Telos and in Diacritics, which is another academic journal, in the late 80s and 1990s marks a moment when American intellectual thought had come to be suspicious of the possibility of critical theory itself. The project of critical theory, at least as it was initially conceived, when Paul Boccone founds his journal and is bringing these important thinkers like Marcuse to a wider reading public. Marcuse is also teaching people like Angela Davis is a student of Herbert Marcuse's. Importantly, Abby Hoffman was an important student of Marcuse's as well. So these big movers and shakers of the 1960s. That moment in the late 80s, the revolutionary potential of the 1960s is very much in question. So this accompanied the end of the Cold War as well. So while to its critics, the Telos journal's engagement with Nazis like Schmidt was reprehensible, to supporters of the critical lens of Marxism, um, uh, to supporters, the critical lens of Marxism had lost both its critical edge and its economic existence. During this same period, scholars were also making known the true extent of Martin Heidegger's Nazism as the connections between his philosophy, as between his philosophy and his politics. As the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu states, Heidegger's conception of a dehistoricized philosophy as distinct from the philosopher's biography consists in forcing us, as a result of his great blunder, his embracing of Nazism, to rethink the relationship between philosophy and politics. Even before Americans became interested in Schmitt, his influence and conflicted relationship with scholars was apparent on the continent. Michael Holzel and Graham Ward, translators of Schmitt's Political Theology 2, note in their introduction to that in the post-1968 Germany, the rabbi and theologian Jakob Taubes invited the Russian/French thinker Alexander Kojev to lecture in Germany. The invitation was a political move to inspire leftists with French thought, um, leftists in Germany, right, with French thought. Kojev's response was that the 80-year-old Schmidt was the only person in Germany worth speaking to. When this drew obvious concern among German intellectuals, because Schmidt was not allowed to teach in German universities because he would not go through denazification. He's an unapologetic Nazi and anti-Semite. So this drew concern. Taubes interestingly used the Jewish Walter Benjamin's correspondence with Schmidt as the conciliatory evidence for Kojev's assertions. So when other German intellectuals were like, we're having this guy come in and he wants to talk to Schmidt, the discourse between Schmidt and Benjamin becomes a way of pacifying the concerns. Schmidt had curiously revived the discussion with the long deceased Benjamin in his 1956 book, Hamlet or Hecuba, as I mentioned above. For these Europeans on both the left and the right, and Jewish and Christian, was what was at stake was the relationship between aesthetics and politics. So may ask, what one may ask is so important about Carl Schmitt and these related thinkers, this is an intro to critical theory class, but also like, why are we thinking about critical theory right now? But what's so important about it? So this is a concern that liberals have in general. But it's also certainly a question that Shayla Ben Habib asked in a mini seminar at the Cornell School of Criticism and Theory in summer of 2011, which I attended. And she's certainly not the only one to ask this question, as I've already pointed above. So much like the divisions around the Telos journal covered earlier, as a committed liberal and scholar of Jürgen Habermas and Hannah Arendt, the return to Schmidt is baffling. The larger seminar I was in that summer in 2011, I was attending, was with Victoria Kahn, who I quoted above, who's a scholar of Machiavelli. And our seminar was titled Early Modern, Postmodern Political Theology. And we were essentially looking at the ways that 20th century thinkers looked to early modern thought in order to make sense of their own socio-political crises. I mention this here because it remains a big part of my own reading strategies today, and why students of mine will notice a kind of recursion in my initial historical framing of the discourse of critical theory. So new students should also note that Habermas and Ben Habib are sometimes located as a second generation of the Frankfurt School. So when people are saying, well, what is critical theory? It's like, well, sometimes they break it up, like the Frankfurt School, early Frankfurt School, and then the later Habermas Frankfurt School. So while some current day scholars that I've mentioned in earlier lectures, like Gabriel Rockhill, have critiqued the turn towards liberalism and critical theory as a turn towards the status quo and a dilution of attention to social change, that change that Marx calls for in his thesis on Feuerbach, right? The point of doing the analysis is to change the world, not to just philosophize. The branch of theory associated with Habermas accepts some form of post-World War II liberalism as a base. So returning to Schmitt seems regressive to some of these thinkers, as if we were entertaining Nazism. So for me, and I'm saying this because I believe transparency is helpful to my students here, the return to Schmidt is wrapped up in understanding why some democracies like Weimar Germany failed, why projects that attempt to bring democracy to undemocratic regions, you can think of Iraq or Afghanistan more recently, and fail and end up showing an often unacknowledged complementary association between liberalism and imperialism. So for me, any democracy worth its salt, it must more honestly confront the violence it has depended on and its rise to power, and how it and those privileged citizens within liberal democracies, or democratic culture, I guess I'm editing as I write here, or as I lecture here, within liberal democratic cultures continues to benefit from an ongoing colonial violence while pretending that colonialism or imperialism are things of the past. And I think that that's a big part of what Americans, especially my American students, have, is they come to university and without knowing anything about indigenous genocide in this country, for example. That's probably one of the biggest ones for me. And because they situate colonial violence as something in a distant past, even though when it's still very much present for indigenous people today, it allows them to think to think, well, the liberal culture is one thing and colonialism is a different thing, when really they're part and parcel of the same sort of process, is what I'm saying. Uh, so if we're participating in the ongoing questioning of liberal democracy's claims to legitimacy, we simply need to be more historically honest. Otherwise, we are as likely, I should say, we are as likely as those in Weimar Germany to see threats in it um, sorry, we are as unlikely as those in Weimar Germany to see threats until it is too late. So let me read that again. If we are participating in the ongoing questioning of liberal democracy's claims to legitimacy, we simply need to be more historically honest. Otherwise, we are as unlikely as those in Weimar Germany to see the threats until it's too late. So I say this while I certainly at the same time realize that many right-wing thinkers and podcasters out there, even podcasters I listened to before writing this lecture, accept Schmitt as a kind of hero in their claims that liberalism is itself dead. So there are definitely people, perhaps on both the left and the right, that say that liberalism is dying a slow death, or that liberalism in the more extreme versions is already dead, and that we're heading towards this post-liberal future. And Schmidt's critiques of liberalism were always correct to begin with, and that's why he should be heralded as this great thinker in conservative thought. So I realize that those ideas are out there, or those attitudes are out there. My students should know that such perspectives are out there, but that's not my interest in the presentation of Schmitt in this course. My interest is that my students are able to understand and differentiate between competing voices discussing influential thinkers, whether those thinkers are on the right or on the left. You do not need to, I mean, of course, you get my anti-colonial attitudes in these lectures as well, but my aim is not to convert you to my anti-colonialism so much in this course as it is just to give you a sense of like a spectrum of different kinds of thinkers, how they um, looking at and weighing their attitudes against each other give us a sense, a more definite sense of what the project of critical theory is and was, even if we've updated it or it's changed in the past 100 years. By looking at the further right and the further left, we get a sense of where people like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse are coming from in the project that they call critical theory. I'll continue on with a little bit more of an analysis of Schmitt's actual book in a later lecture before moving on to Lenin. And then we will return back to the classic Frankfurt School thinkers. And then I feel like we'll have a pretty firm grounding from which to start, like really digging into what they're distinguishing as the difference between traditional and critical theory. Thank you for watching. If you are not a student who's already paid for a course and you are getting something out of this, please support us on Patreon. I do this as a labor of love. Have a great day, evening, morning, wherever, whenever you are. Bye.